All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar by the International Solar Energy Society ISES in collaboration with the Global Solar Council. We are very pleased to have all of you here, and we are especially happy to welcome our experts joining us on the webinar today. My name is Arabella, and I am the Communications and Outreach Officer here at the ISES HQ in Freiburg, Germany, and I will give you a short introduction into ISES and the work we do, as we have many new participants joining us on the webinar today. The International Solar Energy Society ISES is a non-profit UN-accredited membership NGO. Our vision is 100% renewable energy for all, used efficiently and wisely. ISES represents a diverse membership of academics, researchers, energy practitioners, consultants, students, businesses, and advocates. ISES works together with like-minded organizations from countries all around the world to advance the renewable energy transformation. There are many benefits to joining ISES, and you can find out more on our homepage. Some of the benefits are the exclusive access to presentations and webinar recordings, such as today's, in the ISES webinar archive. ISES members can also get discounts and even free registrations to ISES events and partner events. Please visit our homepage to see the events we have coming up for 2020. Every month, ISES publishes a newsletter for our members where you can follow our progress and share your news. ISES members can also subscribe to our academic journal Solar Energy, our flagship publication, at a reduced price. And in the ISES online bookshop, ISES members qualify for reduced prices on the different publications. So we welcome those who are not yet members to join today to support our work. For those who are already a member, we thank you for your support. As a special benefit to all attendees of today's webinar, we are very happy to offer you a special discount when signing up as an ISES member. All attendees of this webinar will receive a 20% discount code as a follow-up to this webinar over the next days. This special offer will be valid for 2 weeks only after this webinar, so sign up quickly and join ISES and the global solar community. Now for some brief information on the webinar and especially the Q&A section before we start. During today's webinar, we will hear the presentations by our invited speakers, and you will have a chance to ask your questions in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. For the Q&A session, we invite you to send in your questions, and we are looking forward to your participation. When sending in the questions, please write who the question is for and keep your questions short and precise. Please feel free to start sending in your questions at any time throughout the webinar. I am now happy to introduce you to Dave Renee, ISES immediate past president, for opening remarks, as well as an introduction to the Global Solar Council. And Dave will also introduce you to our moderator for today, Eike Weber. Dave served as president of the International Solar Energy Society from 2010 to 2019 and is member of the current ISES Board of Directors as ISES immediate past president. From 1991 until his retirement in 2012, Dave managed the solar resource assessment activities in the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. He is dedicated to the concept of urgently achieving 100% renewable energy to meet all of our end-use energy requirements. Now, I'm happy to hand over to Dave. Dave, thank you for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arabella. Let me show you my screen here, and I will go to full presentation mode, I hope. Is that working now, Arabella?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Thank you, Arabella, for this opportunity to briefly introduce the Global Solar Council. And I also want to extend my welcome to the many participants joining this webinar. The Global Solar Council was formed during the climate conference in Paris back in 2015 and has become the voice of the world's solar energy industry. ISES is a founding member of the Council and participated at its launch event in Paris, and currently ISES serves on its board of directors and leads its technology committee. The Council brings together associations from both established and emerging markets that represent companies all along the supply chain. The Council's vision is to see solar energy as a leading solution to the world's energy needs, and its mission is to promote the rapid adoption of solar energy globally through market development, partnerships, and education. The Council is engaged in a number of activities to fulfill its mission. These include a focus on policy recommendations to intergovernmental organizations, opening and expanding solar markets everywhere, building partnerships with intergovernmental organizations and institutions, building capacity, and creating 30 million solar jobs by the year 2030, and promoting standards, best practices, quality initiatives, and sustainability. The Council employs a variety of communication strategies to achieve these goals, and as part of its role on focusing on technologies and innovation, ISES is very pleased to present this webinar on floating solar voltaics in cooperation with the Council. So thank you, and now I would like to turn the screen back to Arabella and introduce our moderator for this webinar, Professor Eike Weber. Eike has served as Vice President of the Board of Directors of ISES and is currently the Acting Chair of the European Solar Manufacturing Council. Until mid-2018, he was the CEO of Berkeley Alliance for Research in Singapore. And prior to that role, he served as the director of the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems and was also professor of physics and solar energy at the Albert Ludwigs University of Freiburg, Germany. Prior to these roles, for many years, he was a lecturer and professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Eike is a well-known global expert in semiconductor materials for photovoltaics and microelectric applications. So Eike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for the kind introduction. I think I don't reveal a secret if saying that Dave and I, we enjoyed our years as president and vice president of ISES, and we got a lot of things done and many things moving. So I was delighted when Dave asked me to be the moderator of today's session. So let me just get a little bit started, because we have many friends. We have a very big audience today. I'm afraid soon we might reach the 500 limit, so that some participants might even be locked out because of the limits of participation. The topic is floating PV, and of course most of you in the audience are well aware that photovoltaics, the direct harvest of electricity from sunshine, is in many parts of the world today the lowest cost way to make electricity. The lowest price I have been seeing, what was quoted in big installations, is 1.4 cents per kilowatt hour. This is, of course, for people who are in the field since a long time, and I'm very happy I have with me one of the pioneers, Jochen Luther, who was my predecessor as director of Fraunhofer ISE and as well very active in ISES. He has still experienced the times when solar electricity was at 50 cents per kilowatt hour. So we have done an enormously good job together worldwide, bringing down the cost. And now we are in the phase where we have to implement solar electricity as one of the key pillars of our future renewables-based energy system. And since the 80s, we can observe an about 30% annual growth of the PV deployment. I think there are very few technologies worldwide which show for so long time, this is 40 years, a 30% sustained growth rate. And actually, for old timers, it is amazing to see that we have today 600 gigawatts of PV installed. So this is corresponding to the electric power of 600 nuclear power plants worldwide. Only 400 are installed, so we have already more than that. But of course, we should keep in mind that a nuclear power plant works 6,000 hours a year, whereas solar energy you have only for 1,000 hours in Germany, 2,000 hours in sun-rich areas. So the load factor has to be considered if you talk about how much electricity is created. But my point is, the 600 gigawatts, although they are such an enormous number, are just the very beginning. Because if you want to seriously change our worldwide energy system, the big energy transformation from the fossil and nuclear-based energy system of today to an energy system based on renewable energies. And solar energy will be, together with wind, the two main pillars of this system. We will need a staggering 30 to 70,000 gigawatts, 30 to 70 terawatts of PV. If you compare it with today's installation of 600 gigawatts, you see immediately photovoltaics worldwide is a technology which is still in the embryonic stage. The big growth is coming in the years to come. Today we have an annual installation rate of about 120 gigawatts per year, but this has to go to 200, 300, 500 to 1 terawatt per year, because otherwise we will never reach 30 to 50 to 70 terawatts in 2050. So this is what we will see in front of us. And making these installations, the issue of area of land available for all this gigawatt scale electricity production is of course an increasingly important topic. And therefore it is a very interesting solution to use water areas, water lakes, dams, wherever we have a protected area of water without big waves, to use for solar, even at seasides when you have a protection by a reef, so that the solar PV modules can float on the water. And therefore the topic of floating PV is, as far as I know, the most rapidly growing branch of photovoltaic installations. Of course, we start at a relatively low number, but we are now moving towards the gigawatt scale, and therefore it is getting more and more interesting. And I think this is the reason that the interest in our webinar today was so huge worldwide, and I'm really happy that we have a very distinguished lineup of speakers, so that today you will really learn about what floating photovoltaics is technically, and as well what industry is offering, and as well predictions of where we are going and how it will develop. And of course, I would like to invite all of you to use the Q&A feature of our webinar. You can ask your questions, and we will see which questions we can then ask, and I will do this job to pass on to our speakers. So with this, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who will be giving us a global overview of where floating PV is and where we are going. Susanna Dobotka has been a senior, is a senior energy specialist in the Energy Sector Management Assistant Program of the World Bank, and she is directly in charge of the solar scale-up program there. Therefore, she is ideally suited in order to give us the global view on where we are in terms of PV, of floating PV, and where the predictions and expectations are, where we are going. So, Susanna, I'm very happy to have you with us today, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I hope my screen is showing. Can you see my slide now?
Yes, all good.
Thank you. So I would like to give a bit of introduction to the floating solar topic, but first maybe an introduction to what SMAP is, because that's a very cryptic entity. So SMAP is a multi-donor trust fund administered by the World Bank. So physically we work as a unit of World Bank Energy and Extractives Global Practice. SMAP has been around since 1983 and is basically funded by donors, mostly European donors, as well as a few foundations. And we provide grants and technical support to World Bank in-country analytical and advisory work to inform countries' policies and regulations, but also to inform World Bank's investment lending. And the other stream of work that we do, and this is what we will showcase today, is we are trying to stay on the cutting edge of global knowledge, products and services, And we are doing this with focus on developing countries, even though some of our publications are global. We are trying always to showcase how the given technology or given business model contributes to developing countries. And currently, our work program covers energy access, renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy subsidy reform, governance, markets and planning, and what we call Sustainable Energy for All Knowledge Hub, which is a source of data and reports related to SDG 7 tracking in particular. Now, back to floating solar. So why are countries interested in floating solar? As Eike already mentioned, the primary driver is no need for land. And as you can imagine, this is the driver that kind of was the main push for the first floating solar installations that started, I think, in 2007 in Japan. And as you can imagine, the first installations were actually driven out of Japan and later Singapore and other densely populated Asian countries. There are other advantages to floating solar. There's a possibility to save water in the reservoir because once you install the installation, it's decreasing evaporation. Another advantage is that since water bodies oftentimes are in proximity of demand centers, you can use these surfaces for installations, and that way you don't have to go far away to look for suitable land, which is oftentimes the case for large-scale installations that are ground-based. And what we are in particular interested in the World Bank, because we see demand from developing countries, is the possibility to add floating solar to existing hydropower plants. Because there you can kind of use the existing transmission infrastructure, existing substations, but we're also looking to exploring how hydropower can be basically a giant battery to deal with variable output of solar. We're also interested to explore how solar can manage or help manage periods of low water availability in certain reservoirs and therefore bring resilience. Floating solar is a relatively new technology, and so there's a perception of higher risk than for ground-based installations. Why is that? Well, simply there's a relatively limited track record, and there are still uncertainties around certain aspects of floating solar, given that the first installation has been around for barely 13 years, and of course the lifespan of solar these days is about 25 years. So we don't know really what are the overall lifetime costs of floating solar. We are still, exploring what will be the long-term environmental impact on the reservoir, and then whether all the elements of floating solar plants will perform over time as expected. There are, of course, new elements that are brought by operating in water environment. So how do we deal with electrical safety, anchoring and mooring issues, in particular as floating solar ventures into reservoirs with higher depth or into places with higher waves. And then all the issues related to operation and maintenance. So you are operating on the water, everything is moving all the time. How do you get your people there? How are the installations done in a way that it's easy to do maintenance? All of these issues are still being dealt with. And as you can imagine, as in any nascent industry, there are still relative difficulties in selecting qualified suppliers and contractors. In particular, if you're doing smaller installations, you can imagine that there are some local people that will tell you they know how to do it. And that can be relatively complex. I think for large installations, that's less of an issue, but still something that is an evolving landscape. So why are we interested in floating solar? Is this a large market? Well, for the moment, we are at slightly below 2 gigawatts of actual installed capacity, but the potential is enormous. So the World Bank, together with CERES in Singapore, has done some research on this. And if you were to cover just 10% of existing man-made reservoirs that are around the globe, you have potential to basically generate or to install 4,000 gigawatts of floating solar. And this is speaking just about man-made lakes, and this is not speaking, of course, about anything offshore. Now, what are the costs of floating solar? For the moment, they are extremely site-specific. Of course, they will differ from the land-based projects. You can imagine that the floating structure, anchoring and mooring, and cabling is different than for land-based installations. And then the project-specific costs will depend very much on water variation level, water body depth, the wind loads. All of this will, of course, influence what's your anchoring and mooring system, distance to the shore, so there the cabling will be influenced, and then water quality and salinity. So you'll be choosing different materials when you are in more corrosive environments. I didn't want to go to speculations of what are theoretical costs, so I'm showing here actual data that has been collected kindly by CERES from actual projects on the ground. So as you can see, capex over the last 3 years been anywhere between 48 cents to $1, 1.1. And that's the latest data. Of course, when you take data from between 2014 and 17, they will be higher. In terms of tariffs that the projects reported from selected tenders, mostly from last year, you will see that India is somewhere around 5 cents per kilowatt hour, while Albania project reported around 11 cents or 10 euro cents. Seychelles was the first IPP in marine environment, though very much near shore, and reported just below 10 cents. So the costs in general, I would say, are slightly higher than for land-based projects, but not significantly so. So this is definitely a potential competitor. And of course, in environments where you don't have much options for land-based installations, like small island states, or in places like in India, where you have a huge competition for land, this can be definitely a very attractive option to pursue. Now, we've been working over the last 2 years quite intensively with CERES from Singapore on publishing first 2 very comprehensive reports on floating solar. The first one is the market report, published just about a year ago, and it covers kind of basic motivation for floating solar, why are countries interested in doing this, what are the potential benefits, but as well as challenges that this technology poses. This report contains quite a detailed technology overview, then a chapter on global market and potential for future market development, a chapter on policy considerations and project structuring, because this is quite an important aspect and very different from land-based PV. You need to deal with water authorities. You potentially need to deal with owners of the hydropower plants, etc. So the policy side can be much more complex. We discuss in detail costs of floating solar in this publication, and then there's a chapter that is basically a catalog of suppliers of floating solar system as of a year ago. The second publication that went out about 6 months ago is a much more practical handbook that is more suitable for people that are actually, building their first project. It speaks about all the elements of project cycle, from site identification to energy yield analysis, engineering design, financial and legal considerations, very importantly, environmental and social considerations, and then all the issues related to procurement, construction, testing and commissioning, and finally operation and maintenance. This is supposed to serve as a very practical guide, though of course high level. Both of these publications are freely available, and once this presentation will be circulated, you can actually click on the links that will guide you to those. Now, you may think, why do development banks care? Of course, the publications are one aspect, and we've been very happy with our collaboration with CERES, but of course, CERES has a much deeper experience than us, and basically could have published the publications themselves. We care because our clients care, and developing countries have a lot of ground to cover before first installations can happen. So what the World Bank is trying to do is to support development of regulatory and policy environment that would help uptake of floating solar in our countries. So there are all sorts of issues around coordination of permitting and licensing that require intra-agency cooperation between energy and water authorities. Oftentimes, in many countries, it's absolutely not clear who is responsible for water surface rights and permits. Another aspect to cover is regulations for and permitting of access to existing transmission infrastructure that floating solar usually wants to tap into. Even more complex environment is once you want to start to think about combination of hydropower plants, existing hydropower plants with PV. So you have an existing owner and operator of the hydropower plant, and you want to add a floating solar installation. You can imagine there are all sorts of issues around concession, around pricing of this new power, about how do you mix the two outputs, rule of dispatch, etc. And so we think that the World Bank and as well as other development banks have quite a bit role to play in these considerations. And then, of course, we have a role in investments. So we are trying to be there to help to de-risk first demonstration plans. So guiding countries in structuring of their risks, potentially helping them to access concessional financing. And we, of course, have a large focus on making sure that all of these plans are built using the best environmental and social practices. And we also want for these first plans to follow up on monitoring and evaluation of environmental and social impacts of these plans. Now, having done the first kind of purely floating solar focused publications and thinking about first plans, currently the World Bank is very much focusing on this combination of hydro and solar plants and how to hybridize their outputs. The interest is very clear. Solar is a variable resource. Hydropower generation exists in many countries, is well developed, and is oftentimes dispatchable resource. Combining of the two basically can make solar dispatchable, because you can be using your hydropower plant as a giant battery. And that's of particular interest in small and weak grids. you can think about sub-Saharan Africa or island states, for example. And in these grids, there is a big push to install solar these days, but because of the variability of solar, this can be very challenging for the grids. So any type of storage that you can bring is beneficial. Of course, you can imagine battery storage is coming down in prices and it's of interest, but it's very expensive still. It can provide, durations of storage up to 4 hours, and it's not very well suited for really high temperatures that you can oftentimes find in sub-Saharan Africa. While many of sub-Saharan African countries have very large-scale hydropower dams, and so we're trying to do a bit of thinking about how to hybridize solar and hydropower output so that you get rid of the variability of solar, but at the same time, solar helps the management of water reservoirs of the hydropower plants. As you can imagine, many of these countries go through very clear, dry and wet seasons. During dry season, hydropower is not generating all that much. So that's where solar can kick in. It can actually help as you are going towards dry season to keep the level of the reservoir higher than you would have it without solar being there. And it can potentially also valorize the uses of water for the other uses, such as irrigation. Most of these dams are oftentimes multi-use, so there's a bit of competition for the water. So solar can be actually helping in these situations. So this is our present focus, and we should be publishing a publication on this in a few months' time. What we have also done, and this is a publicly available resource, as you probably know, World Bank supports Global Solar Atlas, which is a freely available resource with very detailed solar potential data that is available. We have mapped into the Solar Atlas all the existing hydropower dams in Africa and in India to start with. And once you are using this feature of the Global Solar Atlas for every dam, basically you can find this type of information. So the information about the dam itself, the solar data that corresponds to the dam, with all sorts of detailed profiles of solar. And so that gives you kind of first guidance of what could be possible in terms of output, how much space is available on the reservoir. But oftentimes, of course, you don't have to do necessarily floating solar installation. You could do also installation just next to the dam and combine the outputs. Now, the last part that I wanted to share is a bit of a planned focus for the future, and that's on near-shore floating solar. There is a keen interest in floating solar in small island states. They have very few options how to install solar. Oftentimes, the roof space is there, but there isn't all that much of it. You can imagine, for example, in Maldives that we are supporting, we have done quite a bit of rooftop solar by now, and they are literally running out of space. And so they're very keen to go to nearshore floating solar installations. But going offshore represents not only technical challenges, but brings very new environmental and social challenges, as you can imagine, because until now, floating solar was basically installed on man-made water bodies, while going offshore means going into natural environments. And so you need to deal with coral reefs, with marine life, and all of this, and it needs to be done in the best ways possible. So what ESMAP plans to do in the next year is to work with another trust fund in the World Bank, which is called ProBlue. This is a trust fund that supports sustainable and integrated development of marine and coastal resources. And we will be working on environmental framework guidance for nearshore marine floating solar, similarly on social guidance. And then we will try to tackle geospatial methodology for mapping of the best suitable nearshore marine floating solar areas that could be included in wider marine spatial plans for countries, so that we guide the countries very quickly and with a free resource towards the areas that should be further studied by environmental studies for their suitability for such installations. So this is where we stand. And I thank you for your attention and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Susanna. I think this was a very good overview, and we already got quite a good collection of questions to you. However, we agreed that we first will listen to all the presentations, and then we will go to the questions and answers, and I'm sure you are well prepared for many of them. I would like to mention, I just sent out a message that during your talk, we exceeded the 501 participant limit, so a few people who wanted to join the webinar were not able to do it. At the moment, we are at 498, so at the moment people can come back, but I think it is a wonderful sign of the importance of this topic and of the global interest in this topic. Now it's my very special pleasure to introduce to all of you Thomas Reindl. Thomas is of German origin, but he is now in Singapore, and he is the Deputy CEO of the Solar Energy Research Institute, SERIS, in Singapore. And as a matter of fact, I don't reveal a secret that SERIS has been very instrumental from the beginning in the floating PV technology, and there you can go and visit and see floating PV installations of different types, different companies. So I'm very happy that Thomas agreed to be participant in our webinar, and the floor is yours, Thomas.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it's my great pleasure to be here and to present our work on floating solar. We have been working in this space for quite some time. We started in 2015, and I share a little bit the journey and the results which we have acquired throughout this work. Just a few words about SERIS. SERIS is Singapore's National Lab for Applied Solar Research. It was founded in 2008, and it is my great pleasure to hear that Professor Jochen Luther is in the call and in the webinar as well. He was the founding CEO of SERIS in 2008 when he started with 2 people, himself and a secretary, and we have brought it now to about 200 staff, out of which 160 scientists and adjunct researchers, and we have grown to space of more than 6,000 square meters. We have state-of-the-art laboratories. You see some in the pictures here. We offer professional services to the industry as well, so we are very open for collaborations around the world, and we also offer professional and consulting services to the industry. In terms of research focus, we cover the entire value chain from solar cells, modules, all the way to systems. And in the systems area, we particularly focus on floating solar, which is where we have a team of 10-12 people, and it's one of our flagship projects here at SERIS, simply also because Singapore has a need for that. And the reason why we have this large testbed, which is 10 different systems with more than a megawatt capacity, the reason for that is that Singapore has a very strong drive towards clean tech and clean energy, and Singapore wants to go green, but as a highly densely built up urban city, we have space constraints. Nevertheless, if you have been to Singapore, you probably have seen some large water bodies, reservoirs, which are part of a rainwater capture system. It's about 6% of the surface area of Singapore are reservoirs. And so this was at the early stages already a consideration in Singapore to use those water bodies for deploying solar technology. And we started about 5 years ago with conceptualizing what would happen, and we wanted to learn. At that time, it was still at the very early stages of floating solar. Not that many manufacturers were around at that time, and not much experience was around. So the government and the respective agencies, they were wondering what will happen to the environment, to the water body, what will be the performance of these systems, what will be the operation and maintenance considerations. And since there was no book to buy on floating solar at that time, or some references to read from, we decided to build our own testbed, and it happened to be a rather large one, 1 megawatt floating solar in 2015 when we planned it, was definitely the largest system at that time around anywhere. And so we started out planning this, and it eventually was inaugurated and commissioned in 2016. We have 10 different systems which are from different suppliers from all around the world. And here you see a picture of how this testbed looks like. And as IT Weber mentioned earlier, you're more than welcome to visit us in Singapore, and we will show you and bring you there, and you can see with hands. Seeing with hands is always more interesting, and seeing is believing. So please do come and visit us in Singapore, and we'll give you a tour around the testbed. The aim of the testbed was really to understand what are the technical implications, what are performance indications, what is the impact on the water body itself. And we also tried to have as much diversity as possible in order to learn as much as possible. And we don't have only pontoon-like structures, which is more prevalent in today's installations when you see commercial installations today. We also have more experimental designs, like with tubes, or very open designs, just to understand and learn as much as possible from our testbed. And it is, as the name suggests, being a testbed, it is in fact a research facility. So we collect not less than 500 parameters from the reservoir in real time. So we have developed a real-time monitoring system, and all these different parameters, which are both meteorological system performance data, mechanical data like motion sensors, how much are the movements of each one of these systems, and the different types of anchoring. So we tried to learn as much as possible, and I'll try to share some of the findings which we have in this webinar today. I will focus probably about around 5 key findings. The first of which is bifacial technology. We get a lot of calls from manufacturers. They want to send us the latest bifacial technology and say, well, this must perform extremely well over water. Just for the fact that one thing which is often overlooked, that the albedo, which is the irradiance that gets reflected from the surface, in this case water, is actually very low. It's in the range of 5 to 7%, as we measured here in our reservoir, which is even less than a grass patch, and definitely less than a normal, and much less than if you have sand or some more reflective backgrounds. So the albedo effect is rather small, and I always try to explain to people, if you go diving, it's actually not dark down there. So light actually penetrates into the water, and only at very oblique angles, which means in the early morning and in the late evening when the sun is at very shallow angles, only then you have reflections from the water surface, which is when you're laying on the beach and you have the sundowner, then you see the beautiful reflections of the sun just before sunset. That's where you have a lot of reflection, but not that much during the day. And we have a comparable system on a rooftop, and that shows much higher reflectance than the one on water. And this is can also be seen in the PR, the performance ratio, where we have rather high values, initial values at least for our rooftop and our water system. And the bifacial effect on the rooftop system is in fact higher than over water. So in contrast to hopes of manufacturers of bifacial technologies, it does not give you a benefit or much benefit for floating solar. The second point I would like to touch upon is the cooling effect, which is often talked about, and we have analyzed this quite in detail, and we categorize our different designs into three categories. One is freestanding, where we have only very few points that touch the water. That means you have a lot of cooling effect from the evaporation of the water, from wind that blows underneath the panel. So we have freestanding types. Then we have what we call small footprint. That's designs where the floating body only covers a small part of the water, and then typically with steel trusses, the solar modules are installed over the water, which means again there is a good cooling effect. And then large footprint, that's what we consider those classic pontoon types, where you have basically a large block of plastic between the water and the solar module, and that obviously does not allow for as much cooling effect as you see in the earlier designs. And if we look at it a bit more technically, we don't need to go into all the details here, but what the figure of merit in this case is the so-called heat loss coefficient. And heat loss for a module means if you lose heat, the module operates at a cooler temperature. So in this case means if the heat loss coefficient is higher, you have a better cooling effect. And if you see the different designs, the freestanding has a higher value than the small footprint and the large footprint. And then we have as a reference system an insulated system. And you see that the freestanding has a much better cooling effect compared to the small and large footprint. And the large footprint is actually comparable to a well-ventilated rooftop system or a ground-mounted system. So if you have a lot of blockage material or plastic between the water and the solar module, then the cooling effect is considerably less than if you have a rather open system. Nevertheless, all the systems which we have considered, if you look at the specific yield and the performance ratio, and this is for the first year, we see that all the systems which are anonymized here as A through H, they are all in the 80+% range for performance ratio, some even stretched in 90%. And we compare this for the case of Singapore against a well-ventilated rooftop system, which has about, or a typical rooftop system in Singapore, which runs at about 78% performance ratio. So we see anywhere between 10 to, or say 5 to 15% increase in energy yield and performance for a floating solar system. And this is a big benefit. And you saw earlier the numbers, the cost numbers for solar around the world, which Susanna has presented. And currently you still have a slight premium for floating solar because the quantities are not there. We have 2 gigawatts installed capacity globally compared to an annual market of 100 gigawatts in total. So we are still in the early stages of deployment, albeit with a huge upside potential. But the cost, and we have also described this in our publications with the World Bank, that going forward, there is no technical reason why floating solar, once it gets to larger deployment quantities that there is no technical reason why it should be more expensive than say a ground-mounted system. And then if you add in the better cooling effect and the higher yield, then your levelized cost of electricity would actually be lower than for ground-mounted system. I have to say that this cooling effect obviously works better in hot climates. We have been working with some partners in Switzerland, for example, up in the mountains where it's generally very cold and the lake freezes in wintertime. Then obviously the cooling effect is not as extreme as we have it in a tropical climate like Singapore. This was the initial performance ratio. Then we also looked as a third aspect into degradation rates. And these are initial data. We are analyzing this now in much more detail and related to the different system designs. It's not conclusive yet if you just look at the numbers, because we have systems like system A, which virtually has no degradation at all. Others are a bit higher, up to about 1 to 1.5%. So we are currently analyzing this much more in detail. Typically, if you look at the numbers, which like Sarah Kurtz from ex-NREL and now has published, they're in the range of about 0.5% per year for normal ground-mounted systems. In Singapore, in this hot tropical climate conditions, we observed slightly higher degradation rates for any type of system, which are more in the 0.8% range. And floating solar here is probably adds a little bit more to that. But yet, as I said, these are the initial trends, and we are analyzing this in more detail, and we'll publish this then and also share it with participants in the greater PV and floating PV community. A fourth point I would like to mention is design issues. And this is something where our contractors and our participants in the testbed probably also learned their lesson. I think there are a great deal of these findings, which I'm going to show next, have been taken up by the industry, and I think there are very interesting novel designs and concepts around. And one of the classic cases is connectors and cables touching the water. The tricky part is that the system are constantly in move, no matter how you anchor and how your mooring concept is designed. They will always be in some kind of movement. So you need to give some slack to the cables, but if you have a little bit too much of that, then either the cable or the connectors touch water or even get submerged in water, which they are typically not designed for. So there are newer concepts which have been upcoming, particularly in Europe. If you look at companies like Zimfloat, they have very interesting cable routing and design elements. So there are interesting and new evolvements in this space, but nevertheless, we have seen this also in rather new installations, that cables touch the water. Now, movement in general is a challenge. We see this in our testbed, and I have to say the reservoir where our testbed is located is very calm. So if you have a little bit more wave, and what we heard earlier, that hydropower, some of the hydropower dams, they have very large reservoirs, and the larger the reservoir, the more what you call the fetch is, where the wind builds up and makes even choppy waves in some of the larger reservoirs, and then that would cause much more vibrations and much and impacts on the structures. We have snapped cables from the mooring and anchoring lines. We have damaged sheath, and we see that cables snapping also for grounding cables and equipotential bonding. And I would say people often underestimate the fact that the moment you put your floating solar system on water, it will never ever stand still again. It's constantly moving, and as I showed earlier, we have motion sensors on all our 10 different floats, and they have different degrees of movements. We measure 6 degrees of freedom for movements, meaning the 3 directions plus rotations around the 3 directions. And we see, again, there's no time whatsoever where this system would be still. So there's a constant stress on mechanical stress, both on the joints as well as on the cable connections. So these are design issues which we are observing, but also from a material perspective, we are looking into things which we wouldn't have expected initially, to be honest. One is insulation resistance, and that stems from the fact that the cables being so close to the water, and I'm not talking about those which are physically submerged in water, just having this rather high humidity environment, the cables apparently absorb moisture, particularly at nighttime, and then the inverter senses, and when you see that the irradiance goes up in the morning, you see that the current and the power and the performance ratio is 0. We realize that it takes a few hours sometimes that the moisture which has been absorbed by the insulation of the cable has been evaporated, and only then the insulation resistance goes down low enough so that the inverter doesn't sense any ground faults anymore and starts operation. So we are also in discussion with cable insulation manufacturers, which are some of the large chemical companies, how to address this problem and how to possibly develop cables which do not show such an impact. More O&M issues. We do have animal visits, and if we go counterclockwise, so we do have snakes, which we found in our cable trays. We have lizards. This fellow, unfortunately, well, he now knows that you don't bridge plus and minus, but probably a bit too late for him. We have otters. We have reasonably good wildlife even in the water. We don't have much environmental or negative environmental impact, but that's more from the fact that the size of our test bed compared to the entire reservoir is very small. So it's also very difficult to define any impacts on flora and fauna in the water body. But we also have not seen any adverse effects from our test bed. And then in the upper right, this is our biggest friends, so to speak, birds. And our test bed is rather close to the seaside. It's an inland reservoir, but it's rather close to the seaside, and we get quite a bit of visits from migratory birds and birds from the ocean. And unfortunately, as you can see in the upper right picture, they sometimes leave greetings behind, and they can be quite severe if they come in larger quantities. You're not the only ones. If you have seen pictures from the Queen Elizabeth Reservoir floating PV system in the UK, they have similar issues. It's also rather close to the seaside, and this has obviously a bit of an impact on your O&M routine, because you need to clean this if you sense this. In general, the cleaning routine would not be more than for say a ground-mounted system. Could be rather less because you have less dusty environment. But if you have these bird visits, you have to act a bit more quickly, and that's basically for two reasons. One is the corrosive consistency of the bird droppings, and the other one, what you can see on the lower right here, is that the bird droppings, if they have a magnitude, as you can see in the upper picture, you also create hotspots, and these hotspots can be very localized. And in this case, we had a half-cut cell which reached about 120 degrees, and that's very close to the say 140, 150 degrees where the encapsulant potentially softens again, and this will definitely cause damages to the encapsulant and to the material, and will have or potentially has impact on the reliability and durability over time. What we also observe, or what we're also working on from a science scientific perspective is potentially induced degradation, because it's constantly in a hot humidity environment. So we're looking at MTPID methodologies. We also look into corrosion for both combiner boxes, inverters, and the metal structures. I mentioned this submerged cables in water, but also the anchoring and mooring system, and this becomes ever more important in hydropower dams, which are sometimes in deep valleys and where you have extreme high water level fluctuations. We're currently working on some projects in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and there some of the water level differences over the course of a year can be anywhere between 20 to 30 meters, and then your system is not supposed to move too much around. So we're looking at all these different issues, and all of the knowledge which we gained here, we publish and share with the industry in order to help everyone to move to jointly move faster and with better outcomes. And we share this information either through these publications, for example, in the World Bank publications, or also via TC82, which is the global standard setting body for photovoltaics, where I happen to be the Singapore representative and also the project leader for a floating PV standard on IEC level. This is currently happening as we speak, and we just formed a group. We have about 10 different countries around the world which will work together to develop a global standard for floating PV. Now, just a bit of an outlook. What's next? I think the reservoir-based PV is already commercially available. So from our research angle, we are looking now much more into offshore floating PV. And for the case of Singapore, there is the first larger scale system being deployed as we speak. It's a 5 megawatt system at the north shore of Singapore in a marine environment. And there we obviously have other challenges. Then we have tides, which are in this case about 2-3 meters. We have waves. We have obviously a much more corrosive environment from the salinity, higher salinity, and particularly for the tropics. And Singapore is an example for that is biofouling, that you have so many barnacles and vibrant water life, and this will inevitably settle down on the structures and eventually add weight to it. And we are trying to understand also how this can be either prevented or you best deal with it. And then the next frontier which we are looking at and already planning is how can we, because I would say if you only put floating solar on marine water compared to reservoir water, which in the case of Singapore is all potable water, drinking water quality, so you have a lot of restrictions. Whereas if you go into the marine environment, you have much more degrees of freedom. And I'm an advocate to say, well, if you just put floating solar, I think it's good for this test bed, but we have so many more degrees of freedom, it would almost be a waste of space. So we try to combine this either with, say, hydrogen production, clean water desalination, or, for example, and this is just one artist impression, combining it with fish farming, potentially crop growing, and then having solar on top of it. So really going into the third dimension and use any possible additional space for solving more, I would say, solving more than one problem, be it food generation in addition to electricity, hydrogen, or clean water generation. Just to the end, I also want to let you know that we started already early sharing with the floating solar community, and we started 4 years ago a conference on floating solar, which is still today the most scientific floating solar conference, the International Floating Solar Symposium, which is always held in the end of October as part of the Asia Clean Energy Summit and the Singapore International Energy Week. So you're more than welcome. Still today it is planned as a physical event. It will likely be a mixed event, physical and virtual. thanks to the current COVID-19 situation. But we will share more through ISES and the Global Solar Council in due course. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm more than happy to answer all your questions later. If you want to get in contact with me for collaborations, research questions, or consultancy, please feel free to drop me an email. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later in the Q&A session.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. This was really a very comprehensive talk. You ran a little bit longer than expected, but I think everybody appreciated that we were able to listen to your talk. And I should mention that the Floating Solar Symposium in 2017 was really the first time I came into contact with the symposium and with this topic. And I must say I can only recommend it because there is very lively discussion of all the issues which are necessary and important. But now we would like to change course a little bit. We go now from the research to industry. Ki-Hye Yang is the founder of the Solar Environment Great Innovation and former chairman of the Floating Solar Task Force by CBC, the Clean Tech Business Club. And he has kindly provided us with a video of his presentation, because by now in Korea it is already well past midnight, and therefore it was much more convenient for him to prepare a presentation together with his assistant Johnson Penn Tika. So Arabella, may I ask you to start Ki-Hye Yang's presentation?
Yes, just a second for that. And I think we are also very happy to welcome Dr. Yang later for the Q&A session. He has taken the courage and joined us, even though it's late at night. And so you all will have a chance to send his question his way. So give me just a second, and then we will start the video for Dr. Yang. In case that any of you cannot see the video we are going to play in a second, I'm going to also put the link into the chat box, so you can also see it there. So I'm going to hit play now, and I hope it's going to work for everybody.
Hello, my name is Dr. Yang. It's my honor to make a speech before you. Especially, I want to introduce my staff. His name is Johnson Penn. He studied in English and came from Cameroon. And then we worked together. My title is Future Technology of Floating Solar, especially Beyond the Energy. You can see the floating house. Looks beautiful. We can make like that floating house. And then I think that humans have a minimum rights should have. And then people should breathe fresh air and then drink clean water. That is the basic human right, I think. And then floating island for all. And then my company is established 1989. Especially, I am an artist. You can see left side white, using only white and black drawing. I draw it myself. I am an artist also. Johnson, what do you think about the most important factor of floating solar?
That's maximum power production, right?
Yeah, maximum power product is also important. But I think that most important thing is first safety, second safety, third also safety. Because if it run, everything is disappeared. Fourth is efficiency. Fifth is design. I think like that. You can see this photo. Mechanical stress caused by constant movement make disappeared everything. This photo, floating PV solar plant in Japan, folded and damaged by typhoon. It is a serious problem to the human. I think the solution is water spring and pile and air pocket. You can see that every floating system in the sea has a water spring. If you go to the sea for catch a fish, if you get on the board, the ship always come out water from the side. That is the water spring. Every floating system should have big and small water spring. It absorbs the wave power, and then it can exist against the storm. And then also need a pile. People saw the drilling barge ship. It's drilling barge ship floating over the water. The depth is more than 3,000 meters. It floated, but there we can make a house and other things we can do it. That is also, they use also a floating pipe. And then, especially at dry season, every water channel can be dry out because of the climate change. At that time, if water come out, water zone make a water channel, and then it decline to the water channel, and then it slope to the water channel and slide and crush each other and then broke everything. That is that make a serious problem. Like this, what pile can prevent like that serious problem. If water channel dry out, it piled on the mud and never moving. It is very important thing. Another important thing is it FPV should floating more than 20 years, and then it can make some problem, and then it can be broken. At that time, air pocket is really important things because it is only flatted, it drawn. But if the structure have an air pocket, it never drawn, and then we can check it, and if we have some problem, we can change some module like Lego, and easily we can separate and install very easily. That is the important thing. And then at winter, mechanical stress caused by ice broke the floating device. It makes a serious problem in winter. Ochang reservoir solar module damaged caused by ice pressure. It is important thing also. Solution is also water spring and pile. Hexagonal structure and piles prevent module breakage due to the ice pressure. It is also very important thing. People think that if they install floating solar, they only think about how can we install cheaper. But I think that is not important thing. Important thing is safety. Another safety problem is purification and pollution. Every floating solar should have installed it in the lake more than 20 years. This photo shows that FPV lake plant installed in Japan in 2015 was recently discovered to be completely covered with algae. It is a serious problem. Japan professor and America professor research about that. And then they found that some of the algae grow very well under the shadow. But people think that most important thing to the algae 3 factor is phosphorus, nitrogen, and sunlight. If we prevent sunlight, people think that algae never come, but it changed. It means that water purification system is important. We use 57 kinds of microorganisms grafted. It purified the water. Exactly not purified. It makes eco-friendly water. Because nitrogen and phosphorus also very important factor to the nature and plant and fish and microorganism. That is the difference, and that is the what we talk about future technology at floating solar. I got the best paper award in 2010 in Houston, America. Another important safety factor is excessive tension on mooring cable. Welding methods has a serious problem because it needs a lot of manpower. Moreover, this is the square structure. And then the power separates only 4 points. And then continuously it have power, it destroyed it. And then our system is using laser cutting, and then it cheaper and faster. And then the system is hexagonal. It means that we separate the power to the 6 points, and then more safety than any others. And then everybody knows that honeybee structure is the most safety structure in the world. At nature, everything is provided, and then we should learn to the nature. And then I want to explain about tension ball. We call it tension ball. Johnson, can you explain about tension ball?
Yes, so basically, as you know, the water level in the lake varies constantly throughout the year. So what this tension ball does is that as this water level varies, the tension in the mooring cables is stabilized by the movements of this tension ball, such that we don't have, like, excessive tension in the mooring cables when the water level goes up, or we don't equally have very weak mooring cables when the water level goes down. And also, these tension balls equally help to maintain a constant pressure throughout all the mooring cables across the entire floating PV plant.
Yeah, if we install 1 megawatt floating solar, we need 56 mooring tension system. But if we did not have tension ball, 1 mooring rope should have sometimes received whole damaged. It can make a serious problem. Our tension ball makes every 56 rope mooring system has the same damage. It is also very important thing. And then people think that if we use dual module, the efficiency of the generating system will become more good. But water absorbs the solar energy. people think that water reflect the energy, but some is reflecting, but most of the energy is observing. If water deeper and deeper, it become more observed. It makes a serious problem, and then we should solve the problem also. I think that if we install a reflection zone on floating structure or water zone, our generation efficiency will become very high. That is the future floating solar structure should have. This is the design. What we want to install in Saemangeum area. At Korea Saemangeum area, Korea government will install 2.1 gigawatt floating system. And then I heard of that German also have a plan to install 10 gigawatts, and then they will make a dual module themselves. It means that they'll make floating device themselves, I think. And then so many places installed like that floating solar, it should be beautiful. And then I think that beautiful landscape and harmonious environment is needed. The photo shows that 4 megawatt floating solar hot-house park, and citizens can visit the floating park. It's very important also. Design is very important, I think. And then with this address, you can check it at YouTube, the video. And then the video shows everything. You can check it.
Okay, so we thank you very much for listening, and we hope to join you later in the future in some exhibition or some conference. Thank you very much.
And then if you have some question, and then make a question, and then we'll reply about that. Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much to Dr. Yang for this presentation, and we are now happy to introduce the final speaker for our webinar today, Sika Gada-Tsangu. Sika is an energy technology and policy researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, and her work involves providing technical assistance to international partners on grid integration of renewable energy and conducting renewable energy screenings and evaluating renewable energy storage deployment potential. Her research experience includes climate change impacts in hydropower in sub-Saharan Africa, waste-to-energy technologies and power systems planning efforts in Ghana and Nigeria, as well as in energy consulting and distilling complex technical information to policymakers and the public. Thank you very much, Sika, for joining us on the webinar today. The floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL for short. It's located in Golden, Colorado. And at NREL, I assist with some international work in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I also kind of contribute to domestic kind of renewable energy assessments and such. Also do some emerging work in hybrid systems and floating solar. So today, what I want to do in wrapping up these presentations is provide an overview of NREL's research in floating solar and some of our initial findings. I want to note that this is a huge group effort, so there are many people who have contributed to this work and continue to do so. Throughout the slide deck, you will see contact details on some slides, so feel free to reach out to people directly if you have questions about specific studies. So just a little background on NREL. It's one of 17 national research labs in the US, and we're specifically focused on renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy storage, and sustainable transportation. And as part of our mission to really be kind of the expert on these topics, over the last several years, we've undertaken various studies in floating solar. So as I mentioned, thank you for helping me sort out the technical issues. As I mentioned, NREL is one of 17 national labs. So today I'll just be walking through some of our main research areas when it comes to floating solar. So for us, over the last several years, we've been getting questions from potential adopters of FPV about the underlying technology itself, some of its benefits, and how to analyze it properly. And at NREL, we have expertise on material science and engineering, technology policy, and then techno-economic analysis. So when we conduct our various studies, we kind of put on all these hats to understand the issue and present like a holistic picture for the different kind of research areas in FPV we've considered. So the four main areas I'll be going over today, kind of tacking onto Thomas's presentation on system performance. I'll briefly touch on ongoing study on system reliability and degradation. I'll kind of briefly touch on some of the co-benefits work we've done, and then spend a bit of time looking at the technical potential assessments we've conducted, and then round up the presentation by touching on some ongoing work on hybrid system modeling. So with looking at reliability and degradation, this ongoing project is in collaboration with the Florida Solar Energy Center in UC Davis, and we're going to be studying 4 existing FPV sites in the US to try and collect performance data. And one specific focus is collecting data on water quality impacts, because we see in the literature that there aren't as many studies kind of detailing performance on that specific co-benefit. And now shifting to co-benefits, we saw that, whether it's in news reports about FPV or different reports, there have been a broad range of co-benefits that have been mentioned when it comes to FPV systems. And so in this study, we wanted to understand which of these benefits can actually be proven or have been proven, and which remain unproven. Okay.
Is it possible for you to change to slide presentation mode, Sika?
Yeah, I'm on slide presentation mode, but yeah.
It doesn't seem to be coming through our screens that way. So, but maybe you should proceed. I don't want to hold this up too much, but it's a little bit small.
But I wouldn't make experiments, honestly speaking. I think in reality, we have a big picture, but we still see on top of it all the Microsoft stuff. I would suggest to continue.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I'll continue. But can you see the float or flop slide?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. So this study is trying to understand which of these co-benefits are actually proven in literature, and kind of the main takeaway from this study is that most of the water-related co-benefits have not been proven in literature. So we reviewed studies up to 2019, and there have been no studies kind of supporting the claims that FPV systems lead to reduced evaporation, improved water quality, among others. So this is really just identifying a research gap that needs to be filled, and the results of this study will be released later this year. And now kind of switching gears to the technical potential assessments. I just want to ground our understanding of technical potential. So when we say technical potential, it's really just an upper bound of how much of a resource is available. So this considers some geographical and maybe land use constraints and some system performance, but it's really the upper bound of the resource that's available, and it typically informs policymakers when they're setting renewable energy targets. But now when you start looking at specific countries and sites and regions, then further economic and market analysis is necessary to determine how much of FPV can actually be deployed for a given area. And we've conducted this analysis at various scales, at the global, national, and then subnational level. So at the global level, kind of in concert with some of the work that has been done by the World Bank, we are kind of finishing up a technical potential assessment of hybrid floating solar hydropower systems. And our initial findings suggest about 5 terawatts of kind of hybrid potential globally. And majority of this potential is in hydro-rich regions. So it can be, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia that have a lot of existing dam infrastructure. And this study will also be published later this year. And at the national level, NREL also kind of published the first national assessment of FPV potential for the US. And our findings suggested that even under conservative assumptions, we could actually meet about 10% of the US's annual generation with floating solar systems. And this study also kind of considered the potential for regions, or considered regions that have very expensive land, that would probably have very expensive land, so FPV would be a more attractive option for those regions within the US. And at the state level, we also kind of have partnered with the Colorado Energy Office and CL Altair. They're one of the largest deployers of FPV systems, to really scale down and understand on the state level how much FPV potential exists. And our recent analysis revealed that there's about 11 gigawatt potential in the state of Colorado, and this can meet about 32% of the state's electricity demand. And now we're kind of doing ongoing work looking at site-specific FPV analysis. So thinking back to the slide I showed on technical potential, this is really going into the economic potential, because now we're considering additional constraints or considerations, whether that's policy, evaporation, economic, and environmental considerations, into determining the feasibility of FPV for various reservoirs in the US. And now I want to wrap up the presentation with highlighting some of our ongoing work in hybrid system modeling. So beyond the US, we also kind of are doing work in Southeast Asia, and this project is trying to create an enabling policy and regulatory environment for FPV systems in Southeast Asia. There's been a lot of interest from our partners in the region, and so we have a twofold kind of objective with this study. The first is to understand the policy landscape for floating solar in the region and identify some of the barriers that may arise when you're trying to deploy FPV. And then we're also undertaking a modeling study, and this modeling study is being conducted in an open source model, and the study is trying to really quantify potential short-term and long-term operational benefits of FPV systems. So moving beyond the co-benefits, just really looking at, if we had a hybrid FPV hydro system, how could it, what is its value to the grid? Will we see that reduced curtailment and other benefits? And the results of this study will likely be released at the end of this year, and all of the kind of information and the model itself will be made publicly available and open source, so that anyone who wants to kind of further interrogate the model and our analysis can do so. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. I apologize that we're not able to see the full screen, but I think Arabella and the ISES team will be sharing this presentation as well. So if you have any questions even after the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me or any of those listed throughout the slide deck. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Sika. I think the presentation worked very well because your slides were clear and large, although you didn't enter the real full presentation mode, so no problem at all. I received quite a lot of questions, and I would like to go into the questions immediately so that we have a chance to get many of them answered. One area of questions, and I got quite a few to this topic, by Yongheng, Batu, Ronald, and others, is the concern about what is the effect of floating PV on the underwater life. And one question was even asked, is there even possible a positive effect on fish cultivation, because the fish might like the shadowing effect. But the main question is really, and the main concern from many speakers, from many attendees, is really the most pressing environmental risks, what happens with the underwater life as an effect of the shadow. I don't know, Thomas, do you want to get started on this topic?
Yeah, there is no clear answer yet to this question. It's just too early to say. What's definitely the case, it's always on a case-by-case basis, and every reservoir is different. As a matter of fact, the largest systems in the world are in China, and they are all in the same area in Anhui province. They are up to 180 megawatts in size, or 150 to 180 megawatts. And those were all on abandoned coal mines. And these coal mines over time have filled up with groundwater, and there's virtually no biolife. So the largest systems which we have out there, they don't have this issue where we could learn a great deal from it. In principle, the most bioactivities in a reservoir are for, and by the way, we are talking about man-made reservoirs. So if we talk about natural lakes, it's extremely difficult to, or it needs a complete new level of design consideration, particularly for this environmental impact. But also man-made reservoirs over time become a biohabitat. As a general rule of thumb, you should stay clear of the so-called littoral zone. The littoral zone is the part between the edge of the reservoir and the depth where the sunshine still reaches the bottom of the reservoir. This is where you have the highest degree of bioactivity. So you should always have a certain distance from the shore side. And then if you have a very large system in mind, it might also be better to not have one big chunk, but spread it out in different patches. And we describe environmental, but also social consideration in our floating PV handbook, which Susanna has introduced earlier, because particularly for donors like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, environmental and social consideration are of extreme importance. So there is no clear direction, but every reservoir is different, and start early doing some baselining. But indeed, there are reservoirs where there are positive impacts because fish become not so easily prey because they can literally hide under the solar panels. And in most cases, we have I'm not aware of any system which has a significant negative impact. The only exception, which Dr. Young mentioned earlier, this one single lake in Japan which had a bit of an algae issue. But other than that, so far we are not aware of any major environmental negative impacts.
Thank you. This is a very good and comprehensive answer. Another set of questions, several questions, touched the issue of security, safety, and of course we have cables underwater. Maybe the voltage which we want to use goes even up, and 10 kilovolt cables would be of course quite a challenge. What do you want to say about the electric security issue, going to higher voltages? what happens with the power electronics, which is in so close contact with water?
For power electronics, so typically the cables, they should not touch the water, and then you're also safe. So this is more a design flaw if they touch the water. For inverter locations, there are two schools of thought. Some go for string inverters, which would then be floating along together with the modules. Typically what happens at the moment is that the very large installations, say the 20, 50, 100, up to 150 megawatts, they use central inverters, which are also floating. They are not floating on one of these plastic pontoons. For those central inverters, as well as the transformers, you have steel or floating steel or floating concrete structures, which are from the classic offshore marine industry. And then from there, then the only part which actually then is underwater, because all the cable routing typically is on top of water, also on dedicated floats. So typically the DC cabling normally does not touch the water, and then only from the inverter, from the central inverter to the nearby substation, this is where you would have submarine grade cables. And they typically run then at medium voltage even. But other than that, there is no in principle, it's touch safe in normal operation anyway, and even if there are if the cable has an opening for whatever reason, it would only be on the DC side, and then you really need to reach plus and minus in order to get an electric, in order to have an electric unsafe condition. There is still some discussion about what is the proper grounding strategy. There are different ways of approaching this, but typically you would do some ground monitoring on impedance and ground monitoring. But there's different schools of thoughts on that. And that also needs to be aligned with the national electric codes.
Yes, actually, there were quite a few questions about related to electric codes, and you mentioned in your talk that you are working at the international standardization. So there is already work underway to establish internationally recommended rules and regulations, or is this the effort only the standardization, the technical standardization?
No, it's mostly looking into the electrical side of things, because it's done through IEC, which by right is an International Electrotechnical Commission. So the standard which we are working on in TC82 is predominantly for design and including electrical standards, less so for the quality of the floats themselves. This would be a different consideration, which may or may not be under IEC eventually. And we also decided not to go for a standard. Initially, it will be what you call a technical reference, because it can be passed much faster than a standard. A standard typically takes 2 or 3 years to pass, whereas a technical reference, which is equally in content, it's just less, you need less agreements among the member countries, and that will be out within, say, a year or so.
Very good. And another set of questions was relating to the evaporation suppression. You showed very nice data on the performance improvement from the cooling effect of PV on water. Are you aware of any study of how much the evaporation suppression really means, how much of an effect it is?
Yes, we have looked into that as well and worked with some partners, also like UC Davis and some of the Silicon Valley companies. So in principle, if you very few people have actually measured that in real world systems, but you can rather accurately model different types of reservoirs. Rule of thumb is pretty much the reduction in evaporation is proportional to the area which you cover on the reservoir. So if you cover 5% of the reservoir, you would have a chance to reduce your evaporation by 5%. But again, this is extremely climate specific, and as Sika mentioned earlier, this is one of the discussion points which are very hard to quantify and to really verify in the real world. So I think that, despite the fact that it's part of those effects where people have put great hope in it, I think that's probably a bit overestimated, the impact on the evaporation reduction.
Yeah, I think what you say is very simple. The simplest model is to say we have no evaporation from the area which is covered by the FPV, and then you just take the fraction of the lake area which is covered. I think this is a very good answer.
This is also proven by three-dimensional modeling. So this is, and because we did this three-dimensional modeling also to understand the environmental impacts, because the environmental impacts which we talked about earlier, they actually start out with a physical impact, and the physical impact is the intrusion of sunlight into the water, which has an impact on the water temperature. And every lake throughout the season in a different way has a so-called stratification, because different temperature layers have different densities, and then this affects the mixture of the water, including the dissolved oxygen. So the physical model typically precedes then the environmental impact modeling, because you have to understand first what will be the mixture and the rotation of the water layers, and this starts with the physical model, typically a three-dimensional model of the reservoir.
Yes, and then there are quite a few questions concerned about how one can get closer to dispatchable energy with the help of floating PV. One question was by Schubert, can it be done by combining it with pumped hydro only? I guess we can as well combine it very well with dams where you have water storage. You don't have to pump up the water if you have excess electric energy, but you can combine it with dams so that the dam can regulate the power when the sun doesn't shine. Are you or Susanna aware of such projects where FPV and water is combined to produce well predictable dispatchable power?
Maybe this would also be a question to Sika. Sika and Susanna.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is a site, a site in Portugal that kind of was commissioned last year, recently, I believe, that is a hybrid FPV plant, and kind of operation is coordinated. And so that would be an example of solar being dispatchable in this setting.
Yeah, yeah.
So in principle, just to add to that, so there are two ways to look at it. One is, as Sika already introduced, co-locating floating PV with hydropower dams, where the feed-in is completely separate in the same substation, but the operation is completely separate. The ideal world, but this depends on the type of turbines which are installed. Ideally, you can use the reservoir as a giant battery, and you adjust for obviously the diurnal cycle that you generate more solar power during the day and run the water power, the hydropower during nighttime. It may happen in seasonal, depending on your dry and wet season, that you can use this. But in the most sophisticated and the world would be where you combine the technical operation, so that, and that depends on the type of turbine which are installed. Like Kaplan turbines can be adjusted rather quickly, so you can actually buffer the variability from solar through the hydropower. There is the Portugal example is a small PV, floating PV system with a reasonably big hydropower dam, so that, but they do it conjointly. The largest combined operation is actually in China in the Longyanxia project. In that case, it is not floating, I have to say, but they combine a huge hydropower dam, 1.3 gigawatts, with 850 megawatt solar farm. This solar farm is obviously not floating, but they do a conjoint operation. They have 4 turbines and they operate the PV system as if it was a 5th turbine, and completely conjointly operate floating PV with hydropower, not floating, but the principle has been proven on very large, in this case, gigawatt scale.
If I may add to this, at the World Bank, we've been studying this issue on a few real hydropower dams in West Africa, and we have prepared pre-feasibility studies for hybridization, and we are studying several levels of hybridization. So basically how much you can add in terms of solar to the existing hydropower dam without any major upgrades that you would need to the substation transmission line, or any changes that would significantly impact hydropower operation. And then with different levels of upgrades all the way to pumped hydros, you know, how much that would cost and what kind of level of smoothness of the output you could get. So, you know, it depends on how much investment you are ready to make, and what would be also environmental impact, because oftentimes you would need a secondary dam to deal with just the water flow. And of course, the question is very different if you're starting from scratch, if you're designing hydropower solar hybrid to start with. So basically, you know, as you are building your dam, so that's a whole different question. But this is something that we are planning to cover in our future publication.
Yeah, Susanna, this is actually very interesting for me, because I have been proposing a dam with a secondary dam for quite some time in order to have a constant water flow down the river and being able to really switch the main power from the dam between 0 and 100%. And you can do this with a secondary dam, but you are not yet aware that this has been realized somewhere.
No, this is really in you know, we see the potential, but as you can imagine, these are projects that will take a while, and they would have huge benefits in countries with very weak grids and great solar potential. But these are also countries that are very poor, and they don't want to be necessarily the guinea pigs of these concepts. So I think it's something that will take off over time, but it's also something that will take time to actually realize.
Yeah.
I also just want to quickly add that hybridization is not new. And so we have a lot of lessons from hybridizing kind of even fossil fuel systems. And now there's more, you know, energy storage, solar, wind, hydro hybridization projects going on. And so there might be a lot of lessons to be learned in kind of how to hybridize FPV systems with hydro dams.
Yeah, one needs new type of models, new type of experience. We do have a whole set of questions about the issue, which was nicely demonstrated in several slides, about surface soiling, problems with bird droppings, problems with salt crystals, which was asked by somebody. So what is going on there? For instance, 2 ideas which come to my mind would be to develop automatic cleaning systems, because FPV has a big advantage compared to standard PV systems where the panels are at an angle, and where this automatic cleaning systems is a very laborious thing. But having panels flat on the water should be very, very easily for automatic cleaning, which can be run each evening and do this job. And the other suggestion which comes to my mind is, has anybody already experimented with bird chasing away, for instance, by ultrasound or infrasound peaks, so that you just make a bump and the birds fly? And if you make it in ultrasound or infrasound, you would not even disturb human population around it. So either automatic cleaning or chasing the birds away is are possibilities. Do you want to say something, Tomasz or Sika?
Yeah, if I start on this, yeah, automated cleaning system in China. They call it shuishang, which is above water. It's not floating, so they have 200 megawatt system, up to 200 megawatt system, which are on stilts, which is particularly for fish farming sites where you still need access to harvest the fish, of course, because they would literally hide before they get eaten. They're on stilts, and these systems by definition are a bit difficult because they're about 2.5 meters high. They're very difficult, so they come automatically with an automated cleaning system. So this is possibly a system which can be also implemented on the if it's a pure floating system, although the cleaning system has to be flexible enough then for adjusting for wave motions, but in most inland reservoirs you don't have that much wave motion. So this is indeed one system. And for bird deterrence, there are two ways. One is ultrasound or any sound effects, which you already mentioned. What we understand is that this is a little bit, it depends a bit. Sometimes the birds get used to it. This is a little bit, you have like this system where your neighbor barking dog, you put it next to your neighbor, and then after a few weeks the dog doesn't care anymore. There is obviously one more efficient system which is using some laser beams, but that's also very expensive. So it needs to be seen how bad the impact is and how often it is, whether it can be done with manual maintenance, automated cleaning, or whether you really have to go the extra mile and put bird deterrent systems.
I think we also have Dr. Yang, who might have some experience with this. Dr. Yang, is this something you can speak to in your experience?
Yeah. About fish farm, I heard of that. Dave told some interest about fish under the water. People think that fish, if provide clean condition and fresh condition, fish grow well. But clean water, fish did not live. And then fish also should uptake the food continuously. And then algae can be food to the fish. And then in the water condition, most important thing is diversity, biodiversity. Some environmental engineer and doctor think that water make clean is important. That is drinking water. Lake water and sea water should be get biodiversity. And then if we install the solar panel on the water, maybe some people think that we cannot make algae grow up. But algae is natural things. But a lot of algae makes a problem. And then we should make biodiversity condition. That is the reason why microorganism technology is needed to the floating solar. And
Dr.
then,
Dr. Yang, I got a question who was concerned about the introduction of microorganisms, because this can as well be, this has to be very carefully done in order to avoid negative effects, right, on the bacterial cultures which are thriving in the water.
So many people think like that, but we did not provide specified microorganism. Nature microorganism we make grow well, and then fish eat microorganism, and then small fish become a food to the big fish, and then we did not use like that kind of microorganism. Nature founded microorganism we use, and then there is no problem. And then in your hand and other condition, microorganism always existed. People think that COVID-19 and other things, but effective microorganism is good for health. Bulgaris and other microorganism we take, and then we make a good condition of water quality. Water also have a strong and healthy condition, and then we should make like that condition if we want to use water surface. And then if we use water surface only for photovoltaic floating solar, that is man's purpose, but nature don't want. If we want water surface, we should think about condition of under the water. That is the reason we need circulate the water. You can see that stream and valley water never polluted and never become dirty. In the valley, you can take a water and then take a drink in Korea everywhere, because Korea have not like that disease condition, or metal and heavy metal did not existed. And then in the valley, rock and other things make a good dissolved oxygen condition, DO. DO become high, it makes good condition for microorganism and others. That is the reason why people and human can enjoy like the nature. And then to use the water surface, we should think deeply about the water condition and then lower water condition also. But people think only about efficiency of the generating effect. But if we use want water, we should make the condition before we install solar panel. For my experience, about 35 more years, I found that few energy of the generating system, we can provide water and use airlift pump. Airlift pump can circulate floating solar under the water, and then it circulates water. It makes the environment more eco-friendly. That is what I have experienced, and I recommend to all of the audience and panels. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, a problem which was related, I would like to make maybe two. One for you, the question of material leakage into the water was raised. Is there any concern about material leakage from the plastic which is in contact with the water and so on?
We already test about the come out from HDP, high density PV and others, and then Korea government want drinking water condition, and then we test about that, and then the world certificate lab test about that, and then result is no problem, because microplastic makes some problem, but we can reuse the plastic and HDPE, and then we can make it and then reduce carbon dioxide more than steel. I think that my question is, if there is a material, harmful material to the water or not. High density PE have not any effect to the water. Before, we use drinking water pot made by PE, PP,
yes,
PP. Yeah. But nowadays, some people think that plastic make a bad effect to the nature. But I think that that kind of opinion is come from steel company. Steel company has a big power and big money. Steel company has a really big make really a lot of carbon dioxide. That is serious problem to the climate change problem.
But this is another topic.
I think that, yeah.
Okay, thank you so very much. I would like to ask each speaker for a final word of greeting, and I would like to start with Susanna. And Susanna, I have the final question to you that was asked by Greg. Can you just explain whether you used in your slides total CapEx for FPV installation or just the installation costs?
Thank you. It's total CapEx, and for further information, A, you can see the market report, and B, Thomas and his group at Ceres, in particular Celine that works for Thomas, is following up on the most recent cost, and you can get in touch with them, and they will provide you all the information. But there is quite a bit of detail in the market report that we published last year.
Thank you. And maybe you want to say goodbye to all the audience which has been listening.
Yes, thank you very much for your participation. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop me an email or anyone else. We will answer. And thanks again also to the organizers.
Yes, and thank you from our side as well for your participation. Thomas, before you say your goodbye, I still have a question here on my desk. And this relates to your running the FPV testbed. Somebody said he has a new FPV design. This was Maximilian Rosner, and he would love to use your testbed. Is this possible? And can you say, are you open for that? And the other question was, how about the test center data? Are they available, or are they available for research, or only within your publications? And of course, please use the opportunity to say goodbye.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, so we have collaborations with partners around the world where we share data, particularly with the National Renewable Energy Lab, with some of Sika's colleagues, where we do joint publication. So we don't put them up publicly at the moment, but through joint collaborations, there is a way of getting access to some of the data.
Very good. Very good.
The testbed itself at the moment is basically full. We may have opportunities to swap the one or the other technology out over time. For technical reasons, we cannot go beyond 1 megawatt, but we are swapping out one of the systems at the moment. In addition, and that's probably also a new piece of information, the reservoir where our testbed on is just got an award. There will be 60 megawatt floating PV installed right next to our testbed. So our testbed will get a big brother. That's a pure commercial operation then. And then we can also do much more research on that 60 megawatt system together with our testbed. So please, if you have any questions or follow-ups or want to learn more about floating solar, please do get in touch with us. We are more than happy for a collaboration or helping out in your project. Just to finish the question from Susanna, just the cost are turnkey installation to the nearby substation. So if you have to upgrade the substation or you have to lay a new transmission line somewhere far away, that's obviously not covered, but to the nearby substation. So I have to say, I really enjoyed this webinar, and if I'm more than happy to continue this conversation with all the hundreds of people who have been out there. So we are more than happy to collaborate anywhere across the world, because our project spread quite far into other parts, not just Singapore. And I really enjoyed it, and I was very happy to be part of it. And I thank Arabella for all the preparatory work, and Ike and Dave for inviting me to be part of this session. So in that case, thanks again, and good night. It's past midnight here in Singapore. Good night from Singapore.
Thank you. And Dr. Yang, you have as well a few final words to say.
Yeah. Thank you for your kind attention, and then thanks for ISES and GSC for inviting me as a speaker. I want finally emphasize that people have a right to take a clean water and breathe fresh air. Yes. That is the reason why we need floating solar, but has water purification and then design. I think that we work together, we can provide a good human right. Nowadays, before I was work for myself, but I am more than 60 years old, and then after now 60 years, I want to work for the human rights. Thank you for your kind attention again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presence in our round. And I would like to ask Sika to say the final words.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to hear everyone speaking, and if I hope this is the beginning of more conversation and discussions. You know, if you have any further questions about NRL's research specifically, feel free to reach out to me directly or any of the others listed in our presentation. And enjoy the rest of your day or your night wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I can tell you from the point of view of the moderator, this was really one of the most exciting webinars. I was never as flooded by questions as I was this time. And I'm happy that we had time to give answer to quite a few of them. I would like to join the thank yous. Arabella, I think you have done a fantastic job. It was really a pleasure to be hosting this meeting. And I already sent a message that we exceeded the limit of 500 participants several times, and some of the people had to wait till they could come into our webinar. So this is not usually the case. This is very successful and shows a great interest in this technology. And of course, it definitely will find many other webinars and similar ways to distribute the information in the future. So thanks to all the audience who was staying with us and asking very interesting questions. I'm very sorry that I could not put up all the questions which we received, but I think the question and answers will be part of the webinar record, which will be available on the ISES website. And talking about ISES is a very good opportunity to hand over to Dave and let us conclude the webinar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'll just turn it back to Arabella for the final word. Thank you all for your participation and your contributions.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. It's been a long webinar. It's been a very full webinar, but I think it's also been an absolutely great webinar, and I'm very happy to see that we got so many great presentations and also such a lively Q&A session in. Before we close, I wanted to get a chance in to have a few more last words. ISES would very much like to invite you to support us in this work that we do by bringing these webinars to you. So please visit our homepage or use the link that you will find in the uploaded presentation to support our work so we can carry on bringing exactly this high quality format of webinars to you. And now for my final announcement before we close, and I know there have been many questions about this. We do, of course, have a recording of this webinar, and it will be available online in a few days on the ISES homepage. And all registrants and all attendees of this webinar will receive a follow-up email exactly explaining to them where you can find the recording. So be assured there is a recording and it is available. For our ISES members, please remember you already have unlimited access to all the past webinar recordings and also all presentations through your ISES members area. So this is a benefit, especially for ISES members, and we very much encourage you to make use of that. And so on behalf of ISES, we thank all of you, and of course, again, the great set of speakers for your participation in today's webinar. We are always happy and we're looking forward to your feedback, so you can contact us anytime at public.relations@ises.org, and you will also receive a little survey in the follow-up to this webinar via email. And if you participate in that survey, you really do help us in providing exactly the kind of webinars that you are looking for. So thank you again very much to everybody who joined us today. I will now end the webinar, and I wish you all a great day all around the world, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.